The avoidant person genuinely believed they would be happier without you, believed that creating distance or ending the relationship would bring relief and freedom and peace, believed that the discomfort they felt in the relationship was caused by you or by the relationship itself, rather than by their own patterns and their own internal conflicts, and this genuine belief drove their decision to push you away, or to end things, or to create the distance they convinced themselves they needed. They told themselves a story that made sense within their defensive framework. Being with you created pressure, created expectations, created intimacy, anxiety that was uncomfortable, and therefore being without you would eliminate this discomfort and would allow them to be happy in their defended independence. They believed this story completely. They weren't lying to you or to themselves when they suggested that things weren't working, that they needed space, that they'd be better off apart. They genuinely thought they'd feel better without you in their life, thought they'd experience relief once the relationship ended, thought they'd be free and happy once they weren't dealing with the demands and the intimacy and the vulnerability that being with you required. But then this happened. Instead of the relief and happiness they anticipated, instead of the freedom and peace they expected, they discovered something entirely different and entirely unexpected. They were miserable. They missed you intensely. They realized that the discomfort they were trying to escape by leaving you was not actually caused by you, but was caused by their own patterns that followed them into their defended isolation. They recognized that what they lost was far more valuable than what they thought they were escaping. They understood too late that you weren't the problem, but were actually the solution to loneliness and emptiness that their defensive patterns create. This discovery is profoundly disorienting for the avoidant because it challenges their entire defensive narrative, because it proves that their instincts about what would make them happy were completely wrong, because it forces recognition that their patterns are not protecting them, but are actually destroying their happiness and their chance for meaningful connection. The realization doesn't come immediately. Initially, there might be relief, might be sense of freedom, might be validation of their choice to create distance. But as time passes, as the initial relief fades, as they sit with the reality of life without you, the truth begins to emerge. They're not happier, they're more miserable, and the person they pushed away was exactly the person they needed. And now that person is gone, and they're left with the defended loneliness they thought would feel like freedom, but actually feels like prison. Why they genuinely believed distance would bring relief and happiness. The avoidant person's belief that they would be happier without you was genuine and was based on specific psychological mechanisms and defensive narratives that made this belief seem logical and true within their distorted understanding of their own needs and their own emotional experience. Understanding why they truly believed distance would bring happiness reveals both their self-deception and the limitations of their self-awareness. They believed distance would bring happiness because they attributed the discomfort they felt in the relationship to you and to relationship demands rather than to their own intimacy, anxiety, and their own defensive patterns. The avoidant experienced significant discomfort during the relationship, anxiety about intimacy, feeling of being trapped or obligated, pressure to be emotionally available, discomfort with vulnerability, sense of losing themselves. But they misattributed the source of this discomfort. Instead of recognizing that the discomfort came from their own intimacy anxiety, triggered by closeness, instead of understanding that their patterns were creating the pressure and the overwhelm, they blamed you and the relationship. They thought, I feel uncomfortable when I'm with this person. Therefore, this person is making me uncomfortable. Therefore, being without this person will eliminate the discomfort. This causal logic seemed sound within their limited self-awareness, but was based on completely wrong understanding of what was creating their distress. They believed distance would bring happiness because they confused the relief that comes from deactivating their attachment system with actual happiness and fulfillment. When the avoidant creates distance, when they end relationship, they experience immediate physiological and psychological relief as their attachment system deactivates. The anxiety decreases, the pressure disappears, the overwhelm subsides. This relief feels good in the immediate term, and the avoidant mistakes this relief for happiness, mistakes the absence of anxiety for presence of fulfillment. They think, I feel relief, therefore I made the right choice, therefore I'll be happy now. But relief from anxiety is not the same as genuine happiness. It's simply absence of discomfort, neutral state rather than positive state. The avoidant doesn't recognize this distinction and interprets the relief as evidence that distance was right choice that will lead to happiness. They believe distance would bring happiness because their defensive narrative romanticized independence and freedom while devaluing connection and intimacy as threats to be avoided. The avoidant has constructed defensive story about themselves and about what they need. They need independence, they need freedom, they need space, they're better off alone, they don't need people. Connection is burden rather than gift. This narrative protects them from acknowledging their deep need for connection and their fear of vulnerability by framing independence as superior state and connection as inferior state. Within this narrative, being without you means being free, means being independent, means being in the superior state they've romanticized. They genuinely believed that returning to their defended independence would bring the happiness that their defensive narrative promises independence provides. They believed distance would bring happiness because they focused exclusively on what they'd be escaping while ignoring or minimizing what they'd be losing. When the avoidant thought about ending the relationship or creating distance, their attention was on the negative, escaping the pressure, escaping the expectations, escaping the discomfort, escaping the intimacy that triggers their anxiety. They didn't adequately consider what they'd be losing: your understanding, your acceptance, your presence, your care, the connection itself. Or, if they considered it, they minimized its value, telling themselves these things weren't that important, or could be found elsewhere, or weren't worth the discomfort they were experiencing. This selective attention, where they magnified the negatives they were escaping, while minimizing the positives they were losing, made the choice to create distance seem obviously correct and obviously happiness-producing. They believed distance would bring happiness because they thought they could maintain the good parts of connection with you through occasional contact or friendship while eliminating the threatening parts. The avoidant engaged in magical thinking where they could have the benefits of connection with you, your understanding when they wanted it, your acceptance as validation, your presence in their life in some form, while eliminating the parts that triggered their anxiety, the intimacy, the expectations, the obligations of relationship. They thought they could create distance, but maintain some thread of connection, could have their independence while keeping you available, could deactivate the relationship without completely losing you. This fantasy made creating distance seem like winning strategy, where they'd be happier because they'd have freedom, plus the parts of you they valued. They didn't understand that connection cannot be fragmented this way, that pushing you away would mean losing all of you, not just losing the parts they found threatening. They believed distance would bring happiness because past experiences of creating distance provided temporary relief that they mistook for sustainable happiness. The avoidant has pattern of creating distance when intimacy becomes threatening, and in past this distance has provided relief. They felt better after ending relationships or after creating space in relationships. They've experienced the deactivation relief and have interpreted it as evidence that distance is solution to their discomfort. What they haven't adequately recognized is that the relief is temporary, that the loneliness and emptiness eventually emerge, that the pattern of approach and withdrawal doesn't actually create sustainable happiness, but creates cycles of temporary relief, followed by increasing isolation and unhappiness. They believed distance would bring happiness this time because it seemed to have worked before, not recognizing that what they remember as working was just temporary relief that didn't lead to lasting fulfillment. They believed distance would bring happiness because their defensive system protected them from fully recognizing how much you mattered and how much they needed connection, allowing them to convince themselves they'd be fine without you. The avoidance defenses work by deactivating their awareness of need and attachment. When they were with you, they couldn't fully feel how much they cared or how much you mattered because these feelings were too threatening. Their defenses suppressed these feelings, making them believe they weren't that attached, that you weren't that important, that losing you wouldn't be that significant. This suppressed awareness allowed them to convince themselves that being without you would be fine, that they wouldn't miss you much, that they'd easily move on. They couldn't anticipate the pain and the regret that would come later because their defenses prevented them from feeling, during the relationship, how much you actually meant to them. The delayed recognition that replaces relief with regret. The avoidant person's initial relief and their belief that they made the right choice to create distance gradually give way to delayed recognition that transforms their experience from relief to regret, from confidence to confusion, from believing they're happier to realizing they're actually more miserable than they were before. Understanding this delayed recognition process reveals why time is required for the reality to sink in and why their initial certainty was deceptive. The delayed recognition begins when the initial relief of deactivation fades and is replaced not by the happiness they expected, but by emptiness and loneliness they didn't anticipate. The first days or weeks after creating distance might feel good. The anxiety is gone, the pressure is lifted, they feel free. But as time passes, as this initial relief normalizes, what emerges underneath is not happiness, but hollowness. They notice absence rather than freedom. They feel lonely rather than independent. They experience emptiness rather than peace. This emptiness is confusing because it's not what they expected. They thought they'd feel happy, being free of the relationship, but instead, they feel empty in ways they didn't when you were in their life. This unexpected emotional state is first indication that their belief about being happier without you was wrong. The delayed recognition accelerates when they attempt to engage with life without you and discover that the discomfort they were trying to escape is still present because it was never caused by you. The avoidant thought that ending the relationship would eliminate their discomfort, but when they try to date others or when they try to engage with life independently, they discover their patterns follow them. They still feel intimacy anxiety with new people. They still feel overwhelmed by expectations. They still want to withdraw when things get close. This recognition that the discomfort travels with them, that it wasn't specific to relationship with you, but is their pattern that emerges in all intimate contexts, is devastating because it proves they made wrong diagnosis. You weren't the problem, they are. And they've lost you, while the actual problem, their patterns, remains completely unaddressed. The delayed recognition intensifies when they compare their life now to their life with you and realize that despite the discomfort they felt with you, they were actually better off then than they are now. The avoidant starts doing mental comparison. When they were with you, they had someone who understood them, someone who accepted them, someone who created safety, someone who cared about their well-being, someone to share experiences with, someone who made life less lonely. Yes, there was discomfort. Yes, there was anxiety, but there was also connection and meaning and warmth. Now they have none of these things. They have their defended independence, but it's cold and empty and meaningless. The comparison forces recognition that the discomfort they were experiencing with you was small price compared to what they're experiencing without you, that they traded temporary anxiety for permanent loneliness, that they gave up something valuable to escape something that turns out to have been manageable. The delayed recognition becomes undeniable when they attempt connections with others and discover that no one compares to what you provided, that what you offered was rare and irreplaceable. The avoidant might date other people, might try to find what they had with you elsewhere, but everyone falls short. No one understands them like you did. No one accepts them like you did. No one creates the same safety or the same depth of connection. The comparison makes them realize that what they had with you was exceptional, that you were special in ways they took for granted, that they're not going to find what you provided elsewhere. This recognition that you're irreplaceable, combined with the recognition that they pushed you away, creates intense regret because it proves they destroyed something rare while believing they could easily find equivalent or better connection elsewhere. The delayed recognition is complicated by seeing evidence that you're doing well without them, proving that you were never the dependent or inadequate party they might have unconsciously assumed. If the avoidant sees through social media or through mutual friends that you're happy, that you're thriving, that you're clearly moving on and building good life without them, it challenges whatever defensive story they told themselves about the relationship dynamic. They might have unconsciously believed that you needed them more than they needed you, that you'd struggle without them, that they were the more valuable party in the dynamic. Seeing you thrive proves otherwise. You're fine without them. You're better, actually. This recognition that you don't need them while they're miserable without you forces confrontation with reality that they were actually the more dependent party, that you were the more valuable party, that they made catastrophic miscalculation about who needed whom. The delayed recognition reaches crisis point when they attempt to reach out or to restore connection and discover they've lost access to you, that the door they thought would remain open has closed. Many avoidants assume that even though they're creating distance, you'll still be there. You'll still be accessible if they change their mind. The option to return will remain available. But when they reach out after weeks or months and you don't respond, or you respond with clear boundaries that you've moved on, the recognition becomes devastating. They didn't just create temporary space. They created permanent loss. You're gone. You're not available. You're not waiting. The door is closed. This recognition that the loss is real and potentially irreversible transforms their regret from abstract feeling into concrete reality with actual consequences they cannot undo. The delayed recognition crystallizes into full awareness when they're forced to admit to themselves that their entire belief system about what would make them happy was wrong, that their instincts and their defensive narratives led them completely astray. This is perhaps the most difficult recognition because it's not just about losing you, it's about recognizing that they cannot trust their own judgment, that their defensive system doesn't actually serve them, that their instincts about what they need are fundamentally distorted. They believed, with complete certainty, that they'd be happier without you. They were completely wrong. This recognition that their entire framework for understanding what they need is unreliable is crisis that forces them to question everything they thought they knew about themselves and about what serves their well-being. What actually happened after they created the distance? they thought they wanted, the specific reality of what the avoidant experienced, after creating distance diverged dramatically from what they anticipated, and understanding what actually happened in their internal and external experience reveals both the failure of their defensive strategies and the consequences of their miscalculation. These are the actual outcomes they encountered, rather than the relief and happiness they expected. What actually happened is they experienced initial relief that quickly gave way to pervasive loneliness that was worse than any discomfort they felt during the relationship. The first days or maybe weeks provided the relief they anticipated: lower anxiety, less pressure, more freedom. But this relief was shallow and temporary. What emerged as the initial relief faded was deep, persistent loneliness. They were alone, not just physically, but emotionally. They had no one who knew them the way you knew them. They had no one to share experiences with. They had no one who cared about their day or their struggles. The loneliness was worse than the intimacy anxiety they were escaping, because intimacy anxiety is acute and temporary, while loneliness is chronic and grinding. They traded temporary discomfort during connection for permanent pain of disconnection, and the trade was disastrous. What actually happened is they discovered they were thinking about you constantly, obsessively, in ways they never did when they were with you and when they had access to you. The avoidant expected that creating distance would mean thinking about you less, that you'd fade from their mind, that they'd be able to focus on their life without the distraction of the relationship. Instead, the opposite occurred. They thought about you all the time. They wondered what you were doing, how you were feeling, whether you missed them, whether you'd moved on. They replayed conversations and memories. They composed messages they never sent. They imagined scenarios of reconnection. The obsessive thinking was consuming and was far more distracting and overwhelming than being in relationship with you ever was. They couldn't escape thoughts of you, even though escaping thoughts of relationship demands was part of what they thought they wanted. What actually happened is they tried to date or connect with others and found everyone lacking, discovering through comparison how special and irreplaceable you actually were. The avoidant might have believed that you were replaceable, that they could find similar connection elsewhere, that what you provided wasn't unique. They tried dating, they tried connecting with new people, but no one measured up. No one understood them like you did. No one accepted them like you did. No one was patient with their patterns like you were. The comparisons all favored you, making them realize that what they had with you was rare, that you were exceptional in ways they took for granted, that they destroyed something irreplaceable while believing it was easily replaceable. What actually happened is their patterns remained or even intensified without you there to challenge them gently, leading to increased isolation rather than the freedom they anticipated. The avoidant thought that without you, without someone gently challenging their patterns or creating any expectations, they'd be free to be themselves. But what being themselves meant in absence of your presence was becoming more isolated, more defended, more disconnected. Without you, to pull them toward connection, even when it was uncomfortable, they retreated further into their defended isolation. They saw fewer people. They engaged less with life. They became more withdrawn. The freedom they thought they wanted was actually increasing isolation that made their life smaller and emptier, rather than fuller and happier. What actually happened is they realized the discomfort they were escaping was their own intimacy anxiety that remained present even without you, proving that you were never the problem. The avoidant thought they felt uncomfortable because of you or because of relationship demands. But when you were gone, when there were no relationship demands, they still felt uncomfortable. Uncomfortable with their aloneness, uncomfortable with their emptiness, uncomfortable with their defended isolation. They realized the discomfort had been coming from internal conflict between their need for connection and their fear of vulnerability, not from you. This recognition that you weren't causing their discomfort, that you were actually helping them manage it by providing connection despite their patterns, was devastating because it meant they'd misdiagnosed the entire situation and had eliminated the very person who was making things better rather than worse. What actually happened is they saw evidence through social media or through mutual friends that you were thriving and moving on, creating panic and jealousy they didn't expect to feel. The avoidant might have assumed you'd be struggling without them, that you'd miss them as much as, or more, than they missed you, that you'd be waiting and hoping for their return. But they saw or heard that you were doing well. You were happy. You were engaged with life. You were surrounded by friends. You were possibly dating someone new. This evidence that you were fine without them created feelings they didn't anticipate. Panic that they were losing you permanently. Jealousy that you'd moved on while they were stuck missing you. Fear that they'd made irreversible mistake. These intense feelings proved they cared far more than they realized, and that they'd made wrong choice in pushing you away. What actually happened is they attempted to reach out or to restore some connection and discovered you were unavailable, forcing recognition that the loss was real and potentially permanent. Many avoidants eventually reach out after some time has passed, testing whether you're still accessible, whether the door is still open, whether they could restore some connection. They send message, you don't respond. Or you respond but make clear you've moved on. Or you maintain firm boundary that you're not interested in reconnecting. This response forces recognition that they've actually lost you, that you're not waiting for them, that the distance they created is permanent rather than temporary. The permanence creates crisis because it transforms abstract regret into concrete loss they must sit with without hope of undoing it. What actually happened is they were forced to confront that their defensive system failed them, that their instincts and their patterns led them to destroy exactly what they needed, creating crisis of self-understanding. The avoidance defensive system promised them that independence would bring happiness, that avoiding vulnerability would keep them safe, that their patterns were protecting them. But the reality proved otherwise. Their patterns led them to push away someone who was good for them. Their defenses didn't protect them, but isolated them. Their instincts about what would make them happy were completely wrong. This recognition creates profound crisis because it means they cannot trust themselves, cannot rely on their defensive system, cannot believe their own instincts about what serves them. They're left confused about what to do or how to move forward when everything they believed about themselves has proven unreliable. Why their realization changes. Nothing about what you should do. The avoidant person's eventual realization that they're not happier without you, that they made mistake in pushing you away, that you were valuable and irreplaceable, while significant for their own growth and self-understanding, changes nothing about what you should do for your own well-being and your own future. Understanding why their realization is theirs to sit with rather than yours to respond to protects you from being pulled back into dynamic that hurt you. Their realization changes nothing because recognition that they made mistake is not the same as having developed capacity to be different in relationship with you. The avoidant recognizes they were wrong about being happier without you. This awareness is an important step, but it's not transformation. Recognition is cognitive and emotional awareness. Capacity is behavioral and relational skill. They can recognize they need you while still lacking ability to sustain intimacy, while still having same patterns that drove the distance in the first place, while still being triggered by closeness and vulnerability. The realization that they were wrong doesn't mean they've developed distress tolerance, emotional availability, or vulnerability capacity that relationship would require. Recognition without capacity means they'd likely repeat same patterns if you took them back. Their realization changes nothing because their misery and their regret are consequences they need to sit with as part of learning from their patterns, not problems you need to solve by making yourself available again. The avoidant is suffering. They're lonely. They're regretting their choice. They're miserable without you. This suffering is not your responsibility to relieve. This suffering is natural consequence of their patterns, teacher, that might eventually motivate genuine change, experience they need to sit with, to understand that their defensive strategies don't actually serve them. If you rescue them from these consequences by taking them back or by making yourself available, you prevent them from learning the lesson that consequences are teaching. Their discomfort is theirs to manage, not yours to solve. Their realization changes nothing because you've done your own healing work and moving forward in ways that going back would undermine, sacrificing your progress for their belated recognition. Since creating distance from them, you've likely done significant healing work. You've processed the pain. You've grieved the loss. You've rebuilt your self-worth. You've possibly opened yourself to new connections. You've moved forward with your life. Taking them back because they've now realized what they lost would mean undermining all this progress, returning to situation that hurt you, potentially re-traumatizing yourself. Their realization doesn't obligate you to sacrifice your healing and your forward movement for their benefit. Their realization changes nothing because someone who had to lose you to recognize your value is not someone who's demonstrated capacity to maintain that recognition when you're available again. The scarcity of losing you, the pain of your absence, the comparison of others to you, these create conditions where your value becomes clear. But if you became available again, if the scarcity was removed, if they had you back, their tendency to devalue what's available would likely reassert itself. They'd fall back into taking you for granted, focusing on the discomfort your presence creates rather than on the value you provide, wanting distance again, once the immediacy of loss was no longer motivating their recognition. The recognition that comes from loss doesn't necessarily translate into sustained appreciation during presence. Their realization changes nothing because they need to demonstrate sustained, changed behavior over significant time before their awareness can be considered evidence of genuine transformation. If the avoidant reaches out expressing their realization, expressing regret, wanting another chance, these expressions are starting point, not end point. Before considering any re-engagement, they'd need to demonstrate sustained behavior change over months, or ideally years. Consistent therapy, demonstrated new patterns in multiple contexts, developed distress tolerance, practiced vulnerability in lower stakes relationships, concrete evidence of capacity building, rather than just awareness of having made mistake. Their current realization is too new and too untested to be basis for trusting that different outcome would be possible. Their realization changes nothing because you deserve relationship where you're valued proactively from the beginning, not relationship where your value was only recognized after loss. You deserve partner who sees your worth while they have you, who cherishes you in present tense rather than only in retrospect, who treats you well because they recognize your value proactively rather than only recognizing it after destroying the relationship through their patterns. The avoidance delayed recognition proves they couldn't value you appropriately while they had you. This is fundamental failure that their retrospective realization doesn't address. You deserve better than someone who can only appreciate you in your absence. Their realization changes nothing because taking them back based on their regret rather than on demonstrated capacity would teach both of you harmful lesson about what's acceptable and what has consequences. If they can push you away, realize they made mistake, and then have you available again simply because they've realized their error. It teaches them that their patterns don't have permanent consequences, that they can destroy relationships and then restore them through expressions of regret without doing actual change work. It teaches you that you'll accept being pushed away and will take people back who haven't done the work to be different. Both lessons are harmful and create dynamic, where the same cycle is likely to repeat because there's no real consequence for the destructive pattern. Their realization ultimately changes nothing because your path forward is about building life that serves you, with partner who can show up now, rather than partner who realizes too late what they had. The avoidance realization is about them, their learning, their growth, their recognition. But your decisions must be about you, your needs, your healing, your future. Your path is about moving forward toward partnerships where you're valued from the beginning, where your worth is recognized while you're present, where you don't have to be lost for your value to be seen. Their realization that they were wrong about being happier without you is information they must sit with and learn from. Your responsibility is to continue your healing, to continue building life that serves you, to remain unavailable to people whose patterns hurt you, regardless of whether they eventually realize those patterns were mistakes. Let them sit with their realization. Let them do their work. And you continue moving forward with your life, building toward future where you're not someone's regret or someone's delayed realization, but as someone's conscious, present tense choice.